We are standing at a crossroads that most people are too terrified to even look at, let alone describe in detail. For decades, the global consensus has been built on a foundation of sand, a dream called the two-state solution that seems to drift further away with every passing year. But what if we've been looking at the wrong map entirely? What if the answer isn't to build higher walls, but to finally acknowledge that the people living between the river and the sea are already in one room together, whether they like it or not? It feels like we are watching a house of cards that has been wobbling for 77 years, and everyone is just holding their breath, waiting for the wind to change. We talk about security, we talk about sovereignty, and we talk about historical rights, but we rarely talk about the reality of human life on the ground. There's a certain kind of exhaustion setting in, a sense that the old ways of thinking have finally run out of road. So what's really happening here? Is the Zionist state actually doomed, or are we just witnessing the painful birth of something entirely new and unprecedented? To understand where we are going, we have to be brutally honest about where we are right now. Most people see Israel as this high-tech modern democracy, but if you look under the hood, the engine is missing some pretty fundamental parts. Did you know that Israel doesn't actually have a written constitution? It's true, back in 1948, the founders promised a constitution by October of that year, but it just never happened. Instead, they rely on something called basic laws, which sounds official, but there's a catch. In a real democracy, a constitution is supposed to protect the people from the government. In the current system, the legislature is basically protecting itself from the people. There is no real separation of powers because the people making the laws are the exact same people executing them. They just walk from one office to another. Does that sound like a stable long-term strategy to you? When you don't have clear rules for the game eventually falls apart. We are seeing that happen in real time as the internal struggle between the secular and the religious tears the social fabric of the country. And then you have the Palestinians, millions of people living under a system where they are controlled by a government they never voted for and which often works actively against their interests. It's a recipe for perpetual friction. You can't keep millions of people in a legal vacuum forever and expect peace to just break out. So here is the radical proposition being put forward by thinkers like Josef Avesar. He isn't suggesting we just wipe the slate clean and start over from zero. That's not how geopolitics works. Instead, he's proposing a federal layer, a superstructure that sits on top of the existing Israeli and Palestinian governments. It's about creating an independent federal government for the entire area, covering Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. We are talking about 15.5 million people finally being part of the same legal conversation. But how do you keep it from turning into a nightmare of one side dominating the other? Well, the plan involves a parliament of 300 members representing 300 specific districts. This isn't just about big blocks of voters, it's about local representation. Imagine a system where an Israeli might actually vote for a Palestinian representative because that person is the best fit for their local district. It sounds like science fiction to some, but it's actually a very calculated way to break the ethnic monopolies on power. The real genius, or maybe the real gamble, is the voting mechanism itself. To pass any federal law, you would need a double majority. That means 55% of the Israeli representatives and 55% of the Palestinian representatives have to agree on the same bill. If one side says no, the bill is dead. It's a built-in veto that forces both sides to move toward the center. If you want to get anything done, you have to find common ground. You have to compromise. Does this actually make sense in a region defined by such deep-seated hatred? Here's the reality. What's the alternative? We've seen what 80 years of defeating the enemy looks like, and it looks like a graveyard. Avesar suggests a rotating presidency, 1 year an Israeli, the next a Palestinian, and a judicial branch that gets its power directly from a new secular constitution. It's about moving the power away from the politicians and putting it into a set of rules that everyone agrees on beforehand. Now, let's look at the psychology of this, because that's where the real battle is fought. Most Israelis are Zionists by default because they were raised in a world where everyone is a potential enemy. It's a survival mechanism. But if you take a step back and analyze Zionism objectively, you start to see a strange paradox. If the core of Zionism is the need for a state to defend the people against an eternal enemy, then Zionism actually requires that enemy to stay relevant. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? If there were true, lasting peace, what would happen to the ideology of a state built on the constant threat of war? Avesar argues that Zionism has actually been harmful to the Jewish people because it traps them in a cycle of endless conflict. It's a house of cards strategy where you're always one loss away from total disaster. If you look at the 270,000 Israelis who have left the country since October 7th, you see the cracks. In the foundation, people are starting to ask, is this really the future we want for our children? And what about the Palestinians? They've faced decades of occupation, displacement, and violence. For them, the idea of a federation with their occupier sounds like a betrayal of their own national aspirations. But look at the numbers. While maybe 80% of Israelis and 60% of Palestinians would reject this idea today, that still leaves a silver lining of about 4 to 5 million people who are ready for something different. That's a huge base of support to build on. The problem isn't that the plan is impossible, it's that we've been conditioned to think of Israelis and Palestinians as enemies forever. The media, the politicians, the educational systems, they all feed into this narrative of permanent war. But what if we just gave people a choice? Not a choice between this state or that state, but a choice between a future of endless violence and a future of shared legal stability. Avesar isn't trying to convince the die-hard Zionists or the militants. He's looking at the mother of a 10-year-old boy in Israel who knows that in 8 years, her son will have to carry a rifle. He's talking to her. So how do we get there? Does it take a massive external shock? Some people look at the South African model and say we need extreme global pressure, but Avesar is skeptical of that. He thinks pressure just makes people dig their heels in. Instead, he talks about enticement. You don't humiliate people into peace. You give them an option that is better than the one they have. You create a platform for people to actually vote, to run for a federal parliament, and to show that a different reality is possible. You know, it's interesting to think about the Swiss model here. Switzerland is a federation of 26 cantons with different languages and cultures, and they managed to stay at peace by pushing power down to the local level. In this proposed Israel-Palestine Federation, the local cities and regions would keep their own schools, their own police, and their own ways of life. The federal government wouldn't be there to tell you how to live. It would be there to ensure that nobody is killing each other. There are still so many questions, though. What about the settlements? What about the right of return? These are the third rails of this conflict, but under a federal system, these aren't just ideological battlegrounds. They become legislative problems to be solved by elected representatives. Avesar doesn't claim to have all the answers for every single issue. He's proposing a system, a framework where those answers can be hammered out through negotiation rather than through missiles. So why isn't this being discussed by the big global intellectuals? Why are people like Jeffrey Sachs still pushing the two-state solution? Avesar has a theory that is a bit uncomfortable to hear. He suggests that many people, even those who mean well, have a deep-seated prejudice that Jews and Muslims are somehow incapable of living together in a secular democracy. They think the only solution is to separate them like children in a playground, but that's a very condescending way to look at millions of human beings. If you give people a fair opportunity to vote and a stake in a stable system, they usually choose the path that leads to prosperity and safety. We've seen it happen all over the world. Why should the Levant be any different? Is there something uniquely broken about the people there, or is it just that the system they've been forced to live in is broken? I suspect it's the latter. The current setup is politically poisonous, and it's designed to produce the very results we see every day on the news. This is where the strategy shifts from the tactical to the visionary. We are talking about 300 districts that are being mapped out right now. We are talking about simulations that show how these parliamentary debates could actually play out. It's about building the infrastructure of peace before the politicians even realize what's happening. It's a grassroots move to create a legitimate government where none currently exists, because a government is only truly legitimate if it is elected by all the people it controls. So, in my view, we are watching the slow, agonizing death of an old paradigm. The Zionist state, in its current form, is trapped in a loop that it cannot escape without fundamentally changing its DNA. The two-state solution has become a ghost that haunts diplomatic dinners but has no body on the ground. This isn't just another conflict. This is a massive strategic shift toward a one-state reality that is already here, just waiting for a legal framework to catch up with it. If you look at the bigger picture, the choice is no longer between two states or one state. The choice is between a one-state reality that is a permanent, violent apartheid or a one-state reality that is a secular federal democracy. It sounds radical because it is, but when the alternative is another 70 years of what we've just lived through, maybe radical is exactly what we need. We are watching the rules of the game being rewritten in real time, and while it's a terrifying process, it might be the only way to finally turn the lights on in a room that has been dark for far too long.